Welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're going to Lagos, Nigeria, by way of Teju Cole's Every Day is for the Thief.
A novel for a deep dive.
It's more than just a story, though, right? It gives us this incredible view into modern Nigeria
Absolutely. You really get a feel for Lagos in the 2000s, which is when the book is set.
through the eyes of this young man who's returning after 15 years in the U.S. So it's not your typical, plot-driven novel. It's more like snapshots of life and
Right.
observations about Nigerian society.
Yeah, it's almost like a series of interconnected vignettes.
A window into the soul of a city.
Right, and Cole throws you right into the thick of it, too. Like, remember that scene when the protagonist arrives at the airport in Lagos? He's barely off the plane, and bam, he's hit with a demand for a bribe.
Oh yeah, that scene really sets the tone. You immediately get the sense that corruption is kind of baked into the system.
It's not just a one-off incident either. Cole actually uses the term patronage society to describe this system where these gifts or fees are just expected for everything.
Like an unwritten rule.
Totally. It's almost like a parallel economy running alongside the official one.
Hmm. It makes you wonder, though, if everyone's in on it, is it really corruption? Or is it just like the way things work?
That's a question Cole wants you to think about. You see it happening everywhere, from the driver paying off the officer at a toll booth to the doorman expecting a tip, even the beggar on the street.
So it's less about right and wrong and more about just navigating this whole system of favors and obligations.
And it can be really jarring for someone coming from a more westernized context.
Like the protagonist. Yeah, he's constantly trying to figure out, like, what are the rules here? What am I supposed to do?
And then there's that scene at the internet cafe with the Yahoo boys sending out those 419 scam emails.
Right. With that sign warning about 419 activity hanging right there in the cafe.
So ironic.
It's almost like a commentary on the whole situation, right? Like, everyone knows it's happening, but no one seems to be doing anything about it.
Yeah, and it also makes you think about what drives people to that point.
The desperate. Right. It's easy to judge. But Cole makes you consider the lack of opportunity,
Yeah.
the economic realities that might push someone down that path.
Exactly. It's like a twisted reflection of the patronage society itself, right? Like they're finding a way to exploit the system.
Because the system is kind of exploiting them, yeah.
Right. And this whole idea of navigating a system that feels rigged against you is something that the protagonist really struggles with throughout the book, especially because he's returning to Lagos as kind of an outsider.
After 15 years in the U.S., he's not quite sure where he fits in anymore.
Exactly. He's straddling these two worlds and he's trying to reconcile his memories with the realities of the place.
And then there's this constant presence of violence and loss.
Oh yeah, that story about Mr. Adelaja being kidnapped and murdered.
And they're just casually talking about it during a wedding celebration.
Mm.
I mean, it's shocking, but it also reveals something about the resilience of people living in that kind of environment,
Like they learn to adapt.
to find joy, even in the midst of all this craziness.
And you see that resilience reflected in the protagonist, too. He's constantly observing, trying to make sense of this place that feels both familiar and foreign.
Yeah, and those observations often lead to some pretty profound insights, like that conversation he has with his younger cousin, Adebola, about humanism and atheism.
Oh, yeah, that was a fascinating conversation. It really highlights the limitations of the education system and how deeply religion is ingrained in society.
Remember how Adebola believes that all humanists are atheists, just because that's what he was taught in school?
It makes you think about the challenges of critical thinking in that kind of environment.
And it contrasts sharply with the legacy of someone like Ty Solarin, who founded that prestigious Mayflower school where Adebola is a student.
Ty Solarin was a well-respected humanist and educator. He really pushed for enlightenment and critical thinking.
So you have these progressive figures like Solarin trying to challenge the status quo.
While these traditional beliefs and superstitions continue to hold a lot of power.
And it's all playing out against this backdrop of Lagos, this incredible city that's just bursting at the seams.
It's like a giant marketplace, a microcosm of all the energy and contradictions of Nigeria.
Right, you see that so vividly in that market scene that Cole describes.
It's chaotic, it's overwhelming, but it's also full of life.
The protagonist is both drawn to it and kind of scared of it at the same time.
He wants to experience the authenticity, but he's also aware of his vulnerability.
Especially as an outsider.
With his lighter skin, he stands out.
It speaks to this whole question of identity and belonging.
And that sense of vulnerability is just amplified by those instances of mob justice that Cole describes, like that horrifying scene with the young boy accused of stealing a baby.
Burned to death by a mob. It's heartbreaking. It really forces you to confront the dark side of the city.
It's like a reminder that beneath all the vibrancy and energy, there's this undercurrent of violence and desperation.
And it makes you wonder, where do people find refuge? Where's the hope in all of this?
Cole does offer glimpses of hope, though, in some unexpected places, like the M.U. San Center, the Musical Society of Nigeria.
Which is a stark contrast to that rundown National Museum.
It's almost symbolic, right? The museum representing this neglected past.
And M. Yusan representing this vibrant future with all this creativity and cultural exchange.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of chaos and despair, art and culture can offer a sense of connection.
A bridge to the wider world. And speaking of connections, there's that really moving scene where the protagonist reunites with his childhood friend Rotimi, who's now a doctor.
Oh yeah, that conversation is really insightful.
You learn about the challenges of practicing medicine in Nigeria.
And the economic realities, even for educated professionals.
Remember how Rotimi says that the real money is in telecommunications and oil, not in traditional professions like medicine.
It's like an echo of that earlier scene with the Yahoo boys, right?
This idea that the system is rigged, that you have to find a way to game it if you want to get ahead.
And it highlights these economic disparities that are driving so much of the tension in the country. And then, of course, there's the whole absurdity of fuel shortages in an oil-producing nation. Remember that scene with the protagonist and Rotimi driving around Lagos trying to find diesel for the generator?
Ugh, so frustrating.
It speaks to this larger theme of lack of control that runs through the entire novel.
Like the country is sitting on this wealth of potential, but it can't seem to harness it effectively.
The systems are broken, the infrastructure is crumbling, and people are just trying to get by.
Yeah, it's a constant struggle.
And it raises questions about the role of religion and tradition in all of this, too.
How they shape people's lives, their worldview.
Cole doesn't shy away from those questions. He really digs into the contradictions and complexities of modern Nigeria.
And forces us to confront our own assumptions about this place, this culture.
It's a powerful and thought-provoking book, that's for sure. It's almost like they're trying to create this facade of progress, but underneath it all, the systems are still broken.
Right. It's all surface, no substance.
Like building a house on a foundation of sand. It's not going to last.
Yeah, and you see that disconnect from reality in other areas, too, like the way they present history in the National Museum.
Don't even get me started on the museum.
The protagonist is so disappointed by it. He finds the exhibits to be outdated and, well, kind of sycophantic.
It's like they're trying to rewrite history, to gloss over the more uncomfortable parts.
And it's not just about neglect. It's almost like a deliberate attempt to control the narrative.
To avoid those difficult conversations about the past.
Which ultimately makes it harder to move forward as a society.
Exactly. If you can't acknowledge the mistakes of the past, you're doomed to repeat them.
But it's not all doom and gloom, right? Cole also shows us examples of people and institutions that are trying to do things differently.
Oh, absolutely. Like the Jazz Hole bookshop and record label, remember?
Such a cool place.
It's a haven for creativity, a space where people can connect with ideas and music from all over the world.
It's like a breath of fresh air in a system that can feel very stifling.
And the people behind Jazz Hole are so inspiring. They're really committed to fostering a vibrant art scene in Lagos.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of all the challenges, there are people who are pushing for change, for progress.
And that resilience, that determination, is something you see reflected in the way Nigerians navigate religion, too.
Oh, right. Cole really digs into the complexities of faith in Nigeria.
You have this rise of evangelical Christianity, with its emphasis on prosperity and miracles.
But then you also have these deeply rooted traditional beliefs in magic and the supernatural.
It's this fascinating mix of belief systems, sometimes clashing, sometimes blending together in unexpected ways.
It makes you question those surveys that labeled Nigeria as both the most religious and the happiest country in the world.
Especially when you consider that it also ranks very low in terms of corruption.
It's a paradox.
And it's a paradox that Cole forces us to confront. He doesn't offer any easy answers, but he does make us think about the role of religion in shaping society and in individual lives.
And he reminds us that you can't understand a place as complex as Nigeria through simplistic labels or generalizations.
You need to look at the nuances, the contradictions, the individual stories.
And that's where the protagonist's perspective becomes so valuable.
As an outsider-insider, he's able to see things that those who've always lived in Lagos might take for granted.
And he's not afraid to challenge those assumptions, to offer a more critical perspective. Speaking of challenging assumptions, let's talk about Rotimi.
The protagonist's friend who's a doctor.
Yeah, he's successful, but his experiences also reveal some harsh truths about the Nigerian economy.
Like the fact that the real money is in fields like telecommunications and oil, not in traditional professions like medicine.
Even with a good education, it's tough to get ahead.
And that economic frustration feeds into that allure of the get-rich-quick schemes we talked about earlier.
Like those 419 scams.
It's not just about greed. It's about trying to find a way to succeed in a system that feels rigged against you.
And those economic frustrations are made even worse by the everyday struggles of just trying to survive. Like, remember that scene where the protagonist and Rotimi are driving around Lagos trying to find diesel for the generator?
Ugh, that's like a metaphor for the whole country, right?
So much potential, but constantly being held back by these basic solvable problems.
This lack of control over even the most basic necessities creates a sense of precarity that really permeates everyday life in Lagos.
It makes you realize how much we take for granted in our own lives.
Absolutely. And that feeling of precarity, that sense that things could fall apart at any moment, shapes the way people behave.
Like those area boys demanding money just for unloading the shipping container.
Exactly. It's about asserting control in a world that feels very unpredictable.
And in the midst of all this, the protagonist is trying to figure out where he fits in.
He's drawn to Lagos, to his roots, but he's also wary of the challenges.
He's caught between two worlds, and he's not sure which one he belongs to.
And that struggle is really at the butt of the novel.
So before we get to the ending of the book, I wanted to ask you about something that's been on my mind. You mentioned earlier this feeling of lack of control that the protagonist keeps coming back to. Is there anything else in the book that really speaks to that theme?
Well, there's the story of that stolen Benin bronze head that was given to the Queen of England.
You mean the one that General Gowan took from the museum and gave to Queen Elizabeth II as a present?
That's the one, and it turned out to be a genuine antique.
Much to the curator's dismay, right?
Exactly. And the irony is that that bronze head had actually been looted by the British during the colonial era.
And only recently returned to Nigeria.
It's like this symbol of how Nigeria's cultural heritage has been controlled by outside forces.
It's like they're still struggling to regain control of their own story.
And that struggle is reflected in the way history is presented in the National Museum.
Which, as we talked about, is pretty disappointing.
It feels like they're trying to present this sanitized version of history.
One that doesn't acknowledge the difficult parts.
And that's where that idea of a disconnect from reality comes in again.
This reluctance to confront the truth.
Which ultimately makes it harder to address the root causes of the problems they're facing.
But even with all of that, Cole doesn't paint a totally bleak picture, right?
No, there are definitely moments of hope, like those individuals and institutions that are pushing for change.
Like the Jazz Hole bookshop and record label.
Exactly. They're creating this space for creativity and cultural expression.
It's like a little oasis in the midst of all the chaos.
And the people behind it are so committed to making a difference.
It's inspiring.
It really is.
And it speaks to that resilience that we've been talking about.
This ability to find hope even in the most difficult circumstances.
And that's ultimately what resonates with their protagonist as he gets ready to leave Lagos.
He's frustrated, he's disillusioned, but there's still this part of him that's drawn to the city.
To the energy, to the people.
Look, his roots. He sees the complexities, the contradictions, but he also sees the beauty.
And that's why he's left with more questions than answers.
He doesn't know if he'll come back for good, but he knows that Lagos will always be a part of him.
And that open ending, that sense of uncertainty, is what makes this novel so powerful.
It stays with you. It makes you think.
And it challenges you to look at Nigeria and the world in a new way.
To embrace the complexity, the messiness of it all.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Every Day's for the Thief, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away?
I hope they realize that Nigeria is a place of incredible depth and nuance. It's not just a collection of stereotypes or headlines.
It's a place full of stories waiting to be told.
Stories of resilience, of creativity, of hope.
And Teju Cole does a brilliant job of bringing those stories to life.
He challenges us to look beyond the surface and to see the humanity in all its complexity.
It's a book that will stay with you long after you finish reading it, and we definitely encourage all of you to check it out. So until next time, keep diving deep.